There's a meaning in Lubavitch, which the Rebbe actually started exactly 30 years ago. Toshin Mem Beis. To give an acronym, to give a Rosh Tevis for the years. Toshin Mem Beis, the Rebbe said, was Shnas Heishas Bias Mashiach. There's a lot of history behind it. It started when the Rebbe edited the Hayom Yom. Like, Hayom Yom was written in Toshin Gimel, Toshin Dalet. Toshin Yud Zayin, Toshin Yud Ches, they made a new Hayom Yom, and they had to finish the Friedrich Rebbe's biography, because when the Hayom Yom was printed originally, the Friedrich Rebbe's biography obviously only went till Toshin Gimel. So when they redid the Hayom Yom, the Rebbe wanted to finish the biography of the Friedrich Rebbe till Toshin Yud. Versteht sich, once they were finishing the Friedrich Rebbe's biography, so the Rebbe's Maskidim said to the Rebbe, okay, you finished the biography, but you have to begin your biography. So the Rebbe's biography came out on the first Hayom Yom, and it had, I think, 4 or 5 entries, right? Was born, learned Torah B'Hatzlacha, got married, came to New York. Sivan Tov came to New York, and then the Rebbe gave him the various moistus. And then every subsequent Hayom Yom had the same things. It was never updated. In other words, from Toshin Yud Zayin, Yud Ches, until Toshin Mem Beis, the Hayom Yom was reprinted many times, but the Rebbe's biography was never updated. Michal Zelix is a stark. It's like gekocht and Hayom Yom. Moidendik. He wrote whole svarim, but showing the secrets and the Ramazim and the Hayom Yom. And he got from the Rebbe Arishain to update the Rebbe's biography. Later, in Nun Beis, he not only got Arishain to update the end of the biography, but he went back to earlier years and added entries to the Peis and to the Tzaddiks, the different Rabbonim that the Rebbe met, the different Smichas that the Rebbe got. The newest Hayom Yom, the biography is much more detailed. Michal Zelixson wrote it, and I'm imagining that the Rebbe looked it over, and on some level at least the Rebbe was Magiah it. But the first time the Rebbe's biography was updated was Mem Beis. I remember I was in California, it was at this Kislev, we were listening to the hookup, and Yonason Hackner was reading to us what happened. He wrote the Rebbe's biography from Tafshin Yud Ches, I think, until Tafshin Mem Beis, and then the Rebbe added a few lines. Urei zeh amadabar, that Tafshin Mem Beis is Tehei Shnas Bias Mashiach, ubekama Svarim, it says that it's a ketz. If you look in the Hayom Yom, you'll see it. Zelixson updated the Rebbe's Hayom Yom, and the Rebbe wrote, people are saying Amadabar. You know what Amadabar means, the Rebbe, that Tafshin Mem Beis is a Rosh Tevis, an acronym Tehei Shnas Bias Mashiach, and then in certain Svarim Mem Beis is a ketz. When we were growing up, the big ketz that we all looked forward to was Tishlach, Tafshin Lamed Ches. Lamed Ches is a ketz in a lot of Svarim, but the Rebbe brought it. It says in some Svarim that Mem Beis was also a ketz. And from then, the Rebbe himself started giving Rosh Tevis into the years. Teishnas Gulas Mashiach, Teishnas Divrei Mashiach, Teishnas Hamelach HaMashiach, Mashiach Bavadei, Tehizu Shnas Mashiach. Tafshin Mem Ches was only Tismach to Samach. The Rebbe didn't give it a name in connection to Mashiach. Mem Tes was Teishnas Mashiach Toiva. And then Tafshin Nun was Teishnas Nisim. Tafshin Nav was Teishnas Aren Neflois. Nun Beis was a whole bunch. Neflois Bakel. Tehei Shnas Neflois Boy Bo Bohem. There were all kinds of different things that the Rebbe said. Mem Beis, Nun Beis. Nun Gimel was already after the stroke, but the Rebbe was Ma'asher Tehei Shnas Neflois Gedeles and Neflois Degules. And of course, after Nun Daled, it became already Hasidim were guessing, you know. Neflois Haga'ula, all kinds of things. So now this becomes already an even hergish. What do you feel about these acronyms? So since then, every year Hasidim have made up acronyms. To be very blunt, it's not my cup of tea. I'm not into it. But this year is exceptional. Tafshin Ayin Beis is exceptional. And I've heard it said, and I agree, as if my opinion really, really matters, that Tafshin Ayin Beis is Shnas Tovei Olav Baruch. Shnas Tovei Olav Baruch. Why do I think that this year is different? I think this year is different because this Rosh Tevis, Shnas Tovei Olav Baruch, we are really not making up. It's in the Likutei Deburim. It's in the Rebbe Sichos, the Friedrich Rebbe Sichos, the Likutei Deburim. In Likutei Deburim it says that 300 years ago this year was the Baal Shem Tov's 14th year. Baal Shem Tov's birthday is Chayelo. He wasn't 14, he was in his 14th year. And Agav, as a parenthesis, The Friedrich writes in the Kutei Deburim also that you're supposed to celebrate Yovlis, Jubilees. 50-year intervals are very significant. Yeah. So 300 years ago, the Baal Shem Tov was massacring the Takonis, and I'm about to talk to you, right? 200 years ago was the war with Napoleon. And 100 years ago was the eve of World War I. These are not coincidental things. These are very, very serious markers in history. But 300 years ago this year was named by Talmidei Baal Shem Tov Shnas Tovei Alav Bracha. The Baal Shem Tov Chavedim. Baal Shem Tov was only 14, 30 years old, so he was a nister. So the members of the movement, the Tzaddikim Nustadim, named this year, 300 years ago, Shnas Tovei Alav Bracha. So 300 years later, you add the shin, so it's Shnas Tovei Alav Bracha. Shnas is part of the name. So B'meila, this particular year, the acronym is Pashat. We're not making it up. We're actually tapping into an acronym that was made up by Chavedim of the Baal Shem Tov, Tzaddikim Nustadim, 300 years ago this year. Why was this year called Shnas Tovei Alav Bracha 300 years ago? It had to do with a plan that the Baal Shem Tov suggested to the Nustadim, that was implemented, and it was implemented with an incredible measure of Hatzlacha, with a moedendike measure of Hatzlacha. But I have to go back earlier. Go back a little bit earlier. And again, a Hakdome. In Sivan Tafshin Nun Aleph. Sivan Nun Aleph. Maybe with the connection with Chof Sivan Mistami it was, yes? The Rebbe spoke about Poland. But the country of Poland. Now the Poland of today is nothing compared to the Poland of yesterday. Poland, Amolak Tzaitin, was one of the largest countries in Eastern Europe. It was huge. It had big pieces of Russia was Poland, big pieces of Germany was Poland, the Ukraine was Poland. So many of the small central states in Europe, Poland was gigantic. Very, very big. And Poland was not a very modern society. It was a very primitive society, to be sure, like Russia in a way, before the revolution. But Poland was very rich. It was rich because it had natural resources. Poland had a natural resource which was more valuable, pound for pound, than gold. Salt. Because in those days they didn't have refrigeration. So salt was a preservative. And Poland had huge salt mines, so the Polish and noble people were very, very, very rich. They didn't have to be especially smart, because to mine salt, you don't have to be a genius. You understand? It's not like building a rocket and going to the moon to mine salt. But Poland had a system. It was a city-state structure. In other words, it was a bunch of really little countries all bound together. We had the Paritzim, the noblemen, who were very, very powerful, very, very rich, and drunk most of the time. You know, between parties and hunting trips and other vacations, they were constantly entertaining themselves. And they had standing armies, and they essentially owned the people who lived in their territory. They were called serfs, they were indentured. People were basically slaves to them, and very, very poor. Jews moved east. Jews moved to Poland because they had moedendike tzaras in Western Europe. I mean, Jewish people immigrated north, right, from Asia Minor, from Eretz Yisrael. They moved to Spain, they moved to Rome, and then they slowly crept up into France and into England and to Germany, Western Europe, where there was more learning and so forth. But the anti-Semitism that the Jews suffered in Britain and in Prussia and in France and in Spain was so much that by default they moved east. They moved to Poland, they moved to Russia. So the Rebbe brings that sikha from Sivan, Tafshin Nun Aleph, Chaf Sivan, that there are more rights. I would rather eat pas chareva b'medina seinu. I'd rather eat hard bread in our land in Poland, in the Zevach Mishpocha, than all the wealth that they had in Ashkenaz, in Western Europe. The Ramah lived a little bit before Tach V'Tat, a little bit. But for hundreds of years, Jews lived in Poland. They were not rich. They were not able to gather together. There was no big communities. But Klolos, Yidden lived in Shtetelach and on roads, very spread out. But for a few hundred years, Yidden in Poland lived with unbelievable peace. Van der Meise mit den alten Rebben, weißt du, van der Meise mit den alten Rebben. That the Alter Rebbe hat einmal gesagt, I hope I'm not telling the story wrong, but the Alter Rebbe hat einmal gesagt that when Yidden had to leave Western Europe, Yidden were expelled from Western Europe, no country wanted to take them in. No country would take Yidden in. So the Tsar of the Tsar of Poland was offered to take in the Yidden, and the Tsar of Poland says, I don't want to take in the Yidden. They're going to come into my country, and they're going to take over the country, and then they're going to end up leaving. So they negotiated that if Yidden would give him enough gold coins to cover a horse and a rider, in other words, to make a mountain of gold that could cover a man sitting on a horse, then the Polish Tsar was masked to take Yidden. And Kachava, Yidden were allowed into Poland, but they had to give enough gold coins to cover a sus v'reichve. In other words, Yidden went to Poland and they were made to pay all kinds of taxes, all kinds of tribute, because Lamaila was the only way Poland let them into the country. And Yidden lived in Poland very well for many, many hundreds of years. The beginning of the end of Yadus Poland, which is also the beginning of the end of Poland itself, was Tachvatat, 1648, 1649, which is a very long time ago. It's a very long time ago. It's 360, 370 years ago. What was Tachvatat? Tachvatat was like this. The Goyim in Poland were terribly, terribly suppressed. The Goyim living in Poland were terribly, terribly suppressed. Because 98% of the people were serfs and indentured. In other words, they essentially were slaves. They would live on the land. They were not allowed to leave the land. They had to work the land. Most of the profits went to the government, to the poets, and they literally lived subsistence living. It was a very, very hard life. A very, very hard life. They were indentured. The Goyim would give them loans and say, don't worry, you'll pay it back. But it was impossible to pay the loans back because the interest was 25%, 40%. And until you paid your loan, you stayed on the land as an indentured servant, and you basically became slaves. This happens today in the Far East also. It was very, very cruel. So they were taxed highly, they were treated terribly, yeah? And the Jews were right in the middle. Why? Because the Pritzim were drunk all the time. And they needed somebody who was sober, who would keep track of books. So the Rebbe said in that Sicha, Sivan Tafshin Nun Aleph, that every Poretz had a Moshke. Every Poretz had a Yid, and we all called Moshke, Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Rebbe said, why did the Pritzim call their Yidden Moshke? Mazlayu Chazi, they knew that every Yid has a Bechin of Moshe Rabbeinu. So every one of these Pritzim had a Moshke, who ran his books, who collected his taxes, and took care of the loans. Yidden did two things. They collected taxes, and they were involved in loans, because Goyim were frum. So a Goy is not allowed to lend money to another Goy on interest, because from their perspective they were the Yidden, in quotes. So the Jew, who was to them the non-Jew, had to be involved. So the Goyim hated the Jews. Hated the Jews, not because of anything that the Jews did to them, but because what the Jews were doing on behalf of the Peritzim. They were collecting the taxes. They were collecting the interest on the loans. They were enforcing that people couldn't leave the territories until the loans were paid, and they were impossible to pay, and so forth and so on. And the Goyim were terribly suppressed. So from the Ukraine, the famous Cossacks, these kids who were literally raised on horseback, incredible warriors, burst on the scene of Poland and began to kill. Bogdan Chmelenicii was a famous warrior, a militant person. His issue was to overthrow the nobility, to kill the Pritzim. Problem is, it's not easy to kill the nobility. Why not? Every nobleman had a castle. And castles, by the way, were not meant to be beautiful. They were meant to be fortified. Castles had walls. They were many feet thick. And they were built on high precipices where you couldn't access them easily. And castles were designed to protect people. And the Pritzim had armies, had paid armies, had mercenaries, paid mercenaries. But the Jews were sitting ducks. Why? They didn't have castles, that's number one. And they were never even in large communities. In Poland, Beklal, Yidden didn't live that much together. The Rebbe said, the reason that Amor, in Shulchan Aruch, that Amor is the one who always talks about what do you do when you don't have a minyan. They should daven at the same time of the minyan, because that Amor lived in Poland, and in Poland, most Jews lived in Shtetlach, lived on roadsides, lived in forests, lived on fields and in fisheries, where they were spread, because that's how they made a living. So when Chmelenicki's armies ran through Poland from south to north, to kill the Peritzim was not so easy, but to kill Jews was a pleasure, unfortunately. The Cossacks, they were the underclass, the peasants who rose up against the so-called nobility. And they killed more Jews in percentages in the Ukraine than Hitler killed. More Yidden were killed then in the Exodus of 1648-49, what they call Tach V'Tat, there weren't 12 million Jews in Europe in 1648, 1649. Maybe there were 1 million Jews in Europe. But percentage-wise, they killed 85%. I heard this from a geneticist, from a doctor, a scientist, who told me that after Tach V'Tat, there were 50,000 European Jews left. That was it. In other words, the reason we have genetic diseases is because we're all very closely related. This is what he told me. I don't know where this number comes from. But it was a Holocaust of unbelievable proportion. Now, the Polish king woke up from his drunken stupor and discovered that Poland is being burned to the ground. And he mobilized the Pritzim, the landowners, the city-state leaders, to each brought their own private militia, and they fought back. They defeated Chmelenicii, they arrested him, they exiled him to an island where he died. And the uprising of Chmelenicii failed. In other words, after Chmelenicii, Poland remained the same Poland. Inside it wasn't the same. It began to fall to pieces. And by the 1770s, which is about 130 years later, Poland disappeared off the face of the earth. In other words, after 1648-49, Poland was not the same anymore. Russia started to take pieces, Germany started to take pieces, and they pushed H. Tikalach out of Poland. In the 1770s, Poland disappeared. Catherine the Great essentially made the whole Poland Russia. And it wasn't until after World War I that Poland was recreated at the Treaty of Versailles. Poland was artificially created by the British to punish the Germans. They took away from Germany what had been the German part of Poland and made a country of Poland. You understand? And that's why, of course, there was a World War II, which was started over Poland. But this is the history. Consequently, the Yidden living in the southern parts of Poland were absolutely decimated, while the Yidden living in the northern part of Poland, what we would call today Lite, didn't suffer at all. So as a parenthesis, the Alter Rebbe said that the Napoleonic Wars, and of course when Napoleon ran through Russia, especially when he was leaving Russia, he destroyed White Russia. He burnt it to the ground and he killed many people. So the Alter Rebbe said that this was the northern Polish Yidden getting the same medicine of Tach V'Tat 100 years later. It was exactly 150 years later. Pardon. It was exactly 150 years later. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, the Yidden in Lita didn't suffer from Chmelenicii, but when the war with Napoleon and Russia took place in Lita, the destruction that Litvish Jews experienced then was the hemshech of the destruction of Yadis Poland, which had started 150, 160 something years before in the Exodus of Tach V'Tat. This was the Alter Rebbe Tazek said so. Now, what happened as a consequence of this? The first thing that happened, the consequence of it was the Jews who survived got together in communities. And their argument was, wie nicht wie, we have to be able to defend ourselves. If there's going to be another uprising like this, we have to be able to fight back. And the only way to fight back is to have concentrations of people in one place. So Jews, rather than be spread out, as was the traditional matzav of Yidden in Poland, gathered into large groups. What was the problem with gathering into large groups? The kinds of Parnassa that Yidden made simply did not allow for large concentrations. I mean, how many shoemakers do you need? How many tailors do you need? How many blacksmiths do you need? How many milliners do you need? How many people do you need to run a fishery? When you're spread out, there's enough Parnassa for everybody, but when you're concentrated, nobody can make a living. So Jews gathered together in large centers, like Kiev, for example. Their only interest was to protect themselves against another coming of such a tyrant, of such a Retzeach. But the consequence of this was that they suffered from terrible poverty. Now, when you talk about World War II, this is a parenthesis. One of the great miracles of World War II was one of the greatest tragedies in Jewish history, the Holocaust. One of the silver linings to the cloud, one of the little details that's positive, that has to do with World War II is that after World War II, the vast majority of Jews who survived the Holocaust moved. Right? Rubam Kekulim of the Yidden who survived the Nazis didn't stay in Poland and in France, and they moved. They moved to the West. So when you come to a new country, you got to start over. After Tach V'Tat, Yidden lived in the same cities, in the same places, in the blood-soaked earth that their ancestors, blood was swallowed up by. They were living in the same place. And of course, the consequence of this was that they were very, very depressed. They were very broken. So you have to compound poverty, they were very, very poor, by a terrible state of aropgelosenkeit. It's a bracha. Now what happens when people are poor and demoralized? The first thing that suffers under those conditions is education. Children were born to these people, but they couldn't afford to pay them Melamdim, they couldn't afford to teach them, they couldn't afford to hire Rabbonim, they were just sabroch. And this created a terrible, terrible crisis in Poland. Okay, and I understand the Poland then, this is a very different Poland than the Poland of today. But whatever the case is, and this crisis, the nature of this crisis was that every year it got worse, it didn't get better. In other words, instead of, after time passes, people healing and renewing their lives and going forward, it became chronic. It became almost the state of their affairs and their lives. Poor, broken in body and in spirit, and ignorant. Tzaddikim Nestorim were trying to help these people. And they traveled around to all these different centers, seeing the tzaras that Yidden were busy with. And the only thing that they were able to do in helping these Jews was pidyon shvuyim. A Jew borrowed money, he couldn't pay it back, some potters threw him into a pit, some tzaddik nista came along and redeemed him. But redeeming people from pidyon shvuyim is not a solution to a problem. It's like putting patches on a broken pipe. You fix the patch over here, it breaks someplace else. Tzaddikim Nestorim were in a cycle, in a chronic cycle of pidyon shvuyim that was not redeeming itself. It was just non-stop, just not fixing the problem, but dealing with the symptoms. Baal Shem Tov was born 50 years exactly after Gezeres Tachvatat. He was born 50 years to the year. Tov Nun Ches, Tachvatat, together 50 years. And Derech Aga, the Friedrich Rebbe says something very, very sharp in the Siches. That in Shnas Tov Ches, what happened in Shnas Tov Ches? They printed the Shalah Be'esis Merubois. The Sefer Shalah HaKodesh was printed in square letters. Amalek Zeiten, besides for Tanakh and Mishnah, Gemara and Medrash, everything had to be printed in Eisias Rashi. They printed the Shalah Be'esis Merubois, and apparently L'mayla this created a kitrug. Because you're not allowed to print Svarim except for the Chazal and for the Tanakh in Eisias Merubois. And the Friedrich Rebbe indicated that precipitated Tach. Imagine printing the Shalah HaKodesh in Eisias Merubois, big deal. L'mayla this created such a big kitrug that this was in Tachvatat. 50 years later, Shnas Nachas, they reprinted the Shalah in Eisias Merubois, and instead of there being a pogrom, the Baal Shem Tov was born. And 30 years ago, Be'erech, 27 years ago, Tafshin Mem Hei, the Rebbe started a campaign that everything should be printed in Eisias Merubois. Look at the Teira and Teira Er used to be printed in Eisias Rashi. They made a campaign, no more Rashi Eisias. Everything Eisias Merubois. The Rebbe apparently feels that this Medida Agbola, that Sfarim should only be printed in Eisias Rashi, rather than Eisias Merubois, is finished. And the Rebbe says to reprint, like, in other words, even a Rashi and Chumash, instead of printing Rashi and Rashi Eisias, print Rashi in regular Eisias. This is a big chiddush of the Rebbe. Around Memhe, around 85, the Rebbe introduced this idea. In other words, he says we have nothing to fear anymore from Eisias Merubois. If you look at the Buddhim, the pogrom of Tachvatat was the result of them printing the Shalah in Eisias Merubois. So you see how time passes and things change. Baal Shem Tov was born. Tzaddikim Nestorim was still scrambling to deal with this problem and not able to find solutions. Now, as I explained to you last time, the Baal Shem Tov waited till Bar Mitzvah to become a member of Tzaddikim Nestorim. And then he was at a meeting amongst the Nestorim where this question of Yadus Poland was concerned. And the Baal Shem Tov came up with a plan. And the plan had 3 or 4 parts, which I'm going to outline for you. And the plan was so brilliant, such a gewaldige chap, that at that tender age, the Baal Shem Tov was already raised up to some kind of a standing of leadership within the movement of the Baal Shem Tov was 13 years old. He was not only a member of that Tzaddikim Nestorim movement, he was in a position of leadership. What was the plan? The plan had, if you will, 3 or 4 parts. But the most critical part of the plan was, you have to help Yidden make a living. Stop coming to them and teaching them Chumash Rashi and redeeming them from pits. Help them make a Parnassa. This is Baal Shem Tov's first chat. The Rebbe always used to say, the beginning of Chassidus is to help Yidden Bagashmias. And the Baal Shem Tov made a proposal, which the Tzaddikim Nestorim accepted, and they began to implement. This is what it was. The Tzaddikim Nestorim traveled all over the place. And of course, when you wanted to meet Jews, where did you meet Jews? In Mark. He wanted to meet a lot of people. He went to the market because that's where people came. So a tzaddik nista shows up in a market. And of course, in the good spirit of tzaddikim nestorim, instead of condescending on the push of the people, he engages them in conversation, asks them how they're doing and how's their family. And of course, everybody has a mountain full of tzaddiks to share. And the nista listens and cares and empathizes and so forth and so on. And then he says to this person, why do you have to live over here where you can't make a living? Why not move 20 miles from here? There is an inn, a kerechma, which is empty. And I know the poritz. You can rent it from him. And the Jew would recoil in fear and say, are you crazy? I should leave this place and go live in a kerechma? Then Chmelenicii is going to come and wipe me off the face of the earth. Here I'm poor, but at least I have my brothers. We can fight and defend ourselves. And the tzaddik nista says to the Yid, Zorg sich nicht, Chmelenicii is dead. His body is rotten. His bones have crumbled. He's not coming back. Move away from this concentration. Move to this kerechma. You'll have Parnassa. Or move to this forest, harvest trees, you'll have Parnassa. Move to this fishery, rent from a poritz fishing rights on a river or on a lake or some Parnassa. And every Jew had the same reaction. I can't do that. It's suicide. And then the Nestorim would speak to these people and tell them they shouldn't be afraid. The tzaddiks are past. You can establish a life, move, but establish yourself. So most people were very, very frightened by these proposals. But you had a couple of courageous souls who said, you know what, maybe it's not such a bad idea. But then came the last problem of all. Kesef minot. They were open war. So the nista would say, I have money. I'll give you a loan. Tell me how many rubles you need, or whatever it was, zlotus. I will lend you the money. You'll pay it back meshech hazman. Then I'll move. And they convinced one person here, and one person there, and one person someplace else. And the Yidden in Poland began to move away from the concentrated places and make panos. The Nestorim would give them loans. They would start businesses, and then over the course of years, the loans were paid back, and the money was recycled. They used the money over and over and over again. It took 25 years, a whole generation. And slowly but surely, over the course of a quarter century, Yidden in Poland began to push it, breathe. This was plan A. This was the first step. But it was only the first step. As the Yidden began to disperse, the Tzaddim Tzaddikim Nestorim, who had been traveling all over the place, of course, if you didn't have Parnassa, there's less need for Pidyon Shvuyim because there's less Jews not paying loans. It becomes a positive situation instead of a chronic situation. As these Jews are spreading out, the same Tzaddikim Nestorim began to do step 2. A Yid comes to shul in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, opens up the shul, and there's a stranger sleeping on a bench. Shalom Aleichem, was macht a Yid? Wie heißt er? Hirsch. What's your last name? Who Pele? Where do you come from? What difference does it make? And this nister sits in this medrash, and of course somebody invites him into his home to give him a normal place to sleep. He says, no, I'm good over here. I'll sleep on a bench. I'll eat bread. I'm good. And this nister dreizach, he's talking to the people. He's discovering 80% of the people, men, don't know how to read Siddur. The Amaratzis was mavil. And the children don't have anybody to teach them. They're running around like wild animals. And he starts to talk to the people and says, the children are running around. Why don't you get someone together to teach them? And the parents say, we have nobody to teach them. We don't know where we can find a teacher, and we cannot afford a teacher. So he says, I'll teach them. And then he says, wait, but I can't just teach the children, because then the children are going to know more than the adults. I should teach everybody. So within a few weeks of this nister's arrival, he became the Melamdim. He taught the children Aleph Beis, and the adults Aleph Beis, and the old people Aleph Beis. And slowly but surely people began to learn. And this opened up people's eyes to the idea, we don't have to be a Maratzim. We can't have You have to be a God, but you can know something. And there was such a love affair between these Tzaddikim Nestorim and the Shtetl Yidden. The Melamdim was for them everything. And the Melamdim got involved in their lives. He dealt with Shalom Bayis. He helped them with Parnassa. He even helped the disputes between Yidden and Goyim. And the Goyim trusted him. Because the Goyim knew that with this Rabbin, with this Melamdim, they're going to get a fair hearing. And he's not going to side with the Jew because the Jew is on his team. If there was a dispute between a Jew and a non-Jew over monetary affairs, the Goyim knew he would get from this unidentified Melamdim fairness. There was a famous Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov whose name was a couple. And he always used to say, Shivisi Hashem Lenegdi Samid. So people called him couple Shivisi. Couple Shivisi. And the Goyim called him Shivisi. They had no idea what Shivisi meant. So the Goyim called him Shivisi. So it was a Yid and a Goy who had a dispute over money. And they needed an arbitrator, needed a third party. So the Yid says to the Goy, let's go to couple Shivisi. Anyway, they go look for couple Shivisi, and couple Shivisi's gone. He went away. So the Yid says to the Goy, let's go somebody else. We'll find another arbitrator to talk our issues over. And the guy says to the Yid, Eib Shivisi is nishto, is keinzach nishto. If Shivisi isn't here, nothing is here. And of course, he meant Shivisi, the person, but Lepel, he said, if there's no Shivisi, Hashem Negi Sabbath is Godish Faran. And the people developed this unbelievable love affair with this Tzaddik Nister. And they had no idea where he came from. They had no idea how he supported himself. He refused to take their money, lived in Beis Medrash, ate bread and water. It was a win-win, cost them nothing. Yeah? And he gave everything until one fine day, people got up in the morning and the Melamdim is gone, disappeared. He traveled a few hundred kilometers, lay down on another bench in another Beis Medrash far away, and started the same process again. And then he would spend over there 9 months or so, and he'd pick himself up and travel a few hundred kilometers again. And this is how they slowly but surely taught people that they could learn. And of course, the Jews wake up in the morning, the Melamdim is gone. So the first thing they do is they mourn, they sit shiva, figuratively. They loved him so much. They were very broken by the fact that he vanished. Until someone came up with an idea. We can hire a Melamdim. We can pay somebody. And they would send shluchim to Lite, to the northern part of Poland, where Jews had not suffered, and bring back Melamdim, who would continue to teach the children as well as the adults. And of course, the Goylas HaKeseres, the greatest success that could come from these efforts is when parents sent their children away to a yeshiva. The ultimate tatzlocha of this endeavor was when a Polish Yid, by his own initiative, would take a boy of 13, 14 years old with a letter from some rabbi and send him off to the great yeshivas in Lite, in Vilna, and in Slutsk, and in Pinsk, and in Minsk, and in Shklov, and they would come back, B'nai Torah, Talmidei Chachamim, and they would bring back their chaverim from yeshiva to marry their sisters. And this is how Torah was brought back to the Yadus of Poland. This is how it was done. If you ever read the previous Rebbe's memoirs, and if you haven't, you must. You must. One of the personalities which is so central to the story of the previous Rebbe's memoirs, which is really to a great extent the story of the Alter Rebbe's father, is Reuven, the Schmid for Dabra Missel. Reuven was a blacksmith, and he lived in Dabra Missel. He had a son and 3 daughters. He was a Poshtarid, they're a Poshtarid, but he was very affected by the Baal Shem Tov and his Chaverim. And it says the names of the people he was involved with. And they had an incredible influence on him. And they piled, these tzaddikim Nestorim affected, and this Reuven the Shmid, that when he had to find shidduchim for his daughters, he traveled to Lite with the yeshivas, and he brought back 3 Yungalite B'nai Torah, Talmidei Chachamim, Melamdim, to marry his daughters. And of course, even more important than that was that when his son, who was the youngest in the family, grew up, his father sent him away to learn in a yeshiva. Reb Baruch, the Alter Rebbe's father, loved to visit the house of Reuven the Shmid at Dabra Missel, because here he saw the effect of the Baal Shem Tov, a Poshet Yid who loved the Eibishter, who loved mitzvahs and loved Torah, and was Meisei Nefesh for Torah. And another reason that Reb Baruch liked to visit his house was because his son-in-laws were very different. 2 of his son-in-laws were what we would call in our culture Eilamisha, Misnagdim. And the youngest of his son-in-laws was Rabbi Yitzchak Shol, who was himself a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov. And he was much more warm, much more lebedik, much more freilich. And more, above all else, he was much more embracing of Anashim Pshutim. He was much nicer to Amcha. And Reb Baruch used to visit this home, because in this home he would seek the contrast of 2 worlds, and he was able to decide which path he wanted for himself. And of course, the end of the story was Reb Baruch decided to become a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov. So the second step of the program, after you help Yidden Poshet with Parnassa, was to help Yidden with Torah. But there was a third very, very important step. And that's this. In those days, there was a business called Magidim. Preachers. People who made a living making speeches. If you were a good Magid, you had a full-time job in a big city. And basically, to put it very bluntly, you got paid a pretty good salary to tear everybody to pieces, make them feel like garbage. And the more tissue boxes you could expend, and the more tears you could spill, the more you were paid. You know, the better Magid used to frighten people better. And they were Bali Musa. They spoke about Gehenim, and tutors, and pogroms. And of course, the central theme of all their speeches was Torah. You don't learn enough Torah, you don't respect B'nai Torah enough, and so on. The Magidim who were not so good, couldn't get full-time jobs in one town, would do Magidis in 5 towns, but they would take turns. The Magidim who were even less qualified, couldn't get a full-time job anywhere, they were traveling Magidim. You know, like you have people coming around with pieces of paper, you know, with the credentials for tzedakah. Well, those days they had credentials for Magidis. And they would come to a town, they would go to the Rav, or to the Parvus Chedesh, they would present themselves as a Talmud Chacham and as a Magid, and based on their credentials, they would invite the town to come together, and the Magid would get up, and of course the people would make a collection and pay him nicely, and he would make them feel like garbage. And the Magidim were constantly talking about Gehenim, and burning, and Tzaras, and how it's our own fault because of our Avedis, and there was a whole incantation, there was a Nigina, there was a Trop to Magidis. The Poshet Yidden in Poland took this very simply and sincerely. They were very Poshet people, very unschooled. And when the Maggid showed up in town, and they paid him money, and he would tell them how terrible they are, and how they're going to go to Gehenim, and they're going to burn, and they're going to fry, and they're going to roast, because they don't respect Torah, and they don't learn Torah, they would sit and cry. They would bawl. And the Maggid would get more excited, and how do you explain it? I don't know, but bottom line is, he was making a Parnassa by destroying people morally. And if the Maggid was really, really into it, he would mention Chmelenicki's name. That as if it was Yidden's fault that they had these pogroms. And when he would mention Chmelenicki, people would have heart attacks. People would faint. The fear, that name, it was like saying Hitler. It is exactly the same thing as saying Hitler. The fear of this man was so real. And the idea that Chmelenicki was because of their Avedis, and that if they don't do tshuva, the Eibush is going to send the second Chmelenicki, was... Anyway, so the Maggid shows up in town, and the Melamdim is sleeping on a bench in the back of the Beis Medrash. Everybody comes together, they pass around the hat, they make a collection, they give the Maggid money, the Maggid says, right from Darshan. Of course, the beginning of the Drasha is very calm and collected. He's quoting Psukim and Marei Chazal. The people have no idea what he's talking about. And eventually he gets past the formalities and starts talking Divrei Musa. And as he talks, he gets more excited, and he raises his voice, and becomes more passionate, and so forth. Until he starts basically bawling the people out, telling them how terrible they are, and all the tzaddis are their own fault. And people start to cry, and they become very upset, and very emotional. And when this Maggid is like really getting into it, and you know, he's enjoying seeing people's reaction, the Melamdim wakes up, as if he was asleep in the first place. He listens to the drasha for a few minutes, and then he stands up from the back of the room, and he says, Rebbe, I want to interrupt you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, with all due respect to your Torah. I have a kasha. Does it not say in the Gemara, Afa Pisha Chata Yisrael? Doesn't it say in the Pasuk, Kila Yidach Menu Nidach? And the Maggid, this Melamdim, had a list for every curse that this Maggid had. The Melamdim had 5 psukim and Marei Chazal, bringing out how much the Eibishter loves Yidden. Ahavti eschem amar Avayeh, b'ri b'chei Yisrael. And he starts to argue with the Maggid. So the people are sitting there, getting their regular washing down, which they were used to. And here the Melamdim, who taught them Aleph Beis, is engaging this big, prominent rabbi with the beautiful cylinder, and he's telling him, excuse me, God doesn't hate the Jews, He loves the Jews. Jews aren't bad, they're wonderful. Jews aren't sinners, they're ignorant. Jews are not vicious, they're poor. And he goes on and on. And the Maggid and this Melamdim are engaged in an argument. And the Maggid eventually discovers that this Melamdim, this one-eyed cripple, is a Goan Olam, can learn 100 times as well as he, and he's running circles around him. And the Maggid is bankrupt, finished. Speech was completely destroyed. And the people in the shtetl are watching this. And all of a sudden they're hearing a whole new version God doesn't hate them. God loves them. They're not terrible. They're wonderful. Rachmana liba boy. This is the theme of the Baal Shem Tov. God loves the heart. It doesn't matter how much you do. It matters how sincere you are. And all of a sudden, these Pashat Yidden found out they're not bad. They're not bad. They're good. And the joy that they would feel, the sense of redemption, the sense of Yetzias Mitzrayim they'd feel was Pashat indescribable. When the Maggid and the Melamdim finished their argument, and the Melamdim won, they were just, instead of these speeches ending in this condemning, terrible, sad, broken mood, they ended with such joy. It was like a Simchas Torah. And this happened again and again and again. And they started hearing a whole new pshat in themselves. They're Pashat Yidden, but the Eibishter loves Pashat Yidden. In fact, Pashat Yidden in certain pratim could be bigger than the biggest Talmidei Chachamim. The most important thing is Echad HaMarbe v'Echad HaMamet. It doesn't matter how much or how little, it matters that it should be sincere. Rachamona liba boy, the Eibishter loves the heart. And when you hear this again and again and again and again, all of a sudden you start to like yourself a little bit more. And this was the third part of the plan, to raise people up, to tell people the Eibishter doesn't hate them, the Eibishter loves them, they're not bad and they're wonderful. And there's a ribui maises, there's many, many, many stories to this effect. One of the famous stories, you have in Sefer Amam Tafshin Yud Aleph, Arichas the Kesipur, about Rachamona liba boy, of the parents of Reb Zusha and Reb Elimelech. Reb Zusha and Reb Elimelech's parents, his name was Reb Eliezer Lipman. They had no children. And one of these Magidim came through town, it could have been the Baal Shem Tov himself, and he spoke about the Inyan of Rachamona liba boy. He brought the Medrash Rabban Vayikra, that the rich man brought a big fat cow, and the poor man bought a little grass, because the cow wouldn't go into the Beis HaMikdash. And the Eibishter came to the rich man and he told him, you should know that the grass from the poor man was more choshev by me than your sheir mefutim. So he came home from the drasha and he says to his wife that he heard from the Maggid that the Eibishter loves mitanemes. And he and his wife decided that they're going to, he was a water carrier. He was a sheir mayim. He's going to trade. There were different water carriers. And if you had better clients, richer clients, he made more money. If you had poorer clients, you were poor. He traded with one of the other water carriers for the shuls. The shuls didn't pay anything. He took the shuls and he gave up some rich balabatim, so he became very poor physically. But he wanted the schus of bringing water to the Eibishter because the Eibishter, Rachamona liba boy. And that's what he did. And they now lived in greater poverty. Anyway, one Friday when he went carrying water, he found in the well a fish, and he brought it home and gave it to his wife, and she opened the fish, and in the fish was a diamond. He comes home and his wife is crying. What happened? He says, the Eibishter is testing us. The Eibishter is making our life so hard. The Eibishter is testing us. He says, what's the test? He says, look, I found the diamond, and what's going to happen? We're going to keep it, and we're going to be stealing from somebody. It's such a terrible test. We have to get rid of this diamond before Chas v'Shalom we should steal it. Anyway, they come to the Rav, and they tell the Rav, the Eibishter is testing us. We found a diamond in a fish in the well. And the Rav tells them, it's absolutely yours. There's no question about it. You can keep it, sell it, and be rich. And they said to the Rav, we don't trust you. You're not religious enough for us. They sold the diamond and gave the entire money to Tzedakah. And these were the parents of Rabbi Melech Melechens and Reb Zusha Hanepole. In other words, these two acts of Mesiras Nefesh brought them to tzaddikim gemurim, Talmidei HaMaggid. This is a mice, it's a good of the Burim. In the Sefer Asichas Tafshin Yud Aleph. Nocha Sipur, also quite famous, is the following story. Baal Shem Tov came to a market, and he spoke about Rachamona liba boy. One of the Yidden was standing at the periphery of the group. He heard the Baal Shem Tov saying, Rachamona liba boy, the Eibishter liba hearts. He didn't hear exactly what he was saying. He just heard the Eibishter loves a heart. He came home to his wife. He says to his wife, the Eibishter loves heart. So Thursday, when she went to the butcher, she asked the butcher for the heart. Now one day you'll learn yet a day, you'll learn how you have to kasher a heart. I might say shasiva erev, salting because it's smooth. Me'esnish ken hearts, we don't eat it. But in those days you could buy it. So she purchased the heart, she roasted it, and she made 2 chalas, and she gave it to her husband. And when nobody was in shul, he put the chalas and the heart into the Adam Kiddush. The shamish comes to clean the shul out of Shabbos, and he could smell breakfast. He found the food, and he took it. So one Pashat Yid thinks he's feeding the Eibishter. Another Pashat thinks the Eibishter is sending him direct from heaven food. And this went on for many weeks. Both of them think that they're having direct connection to God. Because when he came to Shul Friday night, it was God. Mustama the Eibishter took it. Yeah, who else took it? Yeah. And the other Shamish is thinking the Eibishter Pashat straight from heaven. Anyway, the Rav got wind of it. And the Rav realized how stupid this is. So he calls in this Pashat Yid and it's an not ain't it. But the Eibishter needs a heart. He says, I heard from the Maggid. He says, fool, he didn't mean to give him physically a heart. He meant, anyway, that night the Rav had a dream. He will not survive the year because he took away from the Eibishter 2 Nachas Ruachs. The Nachas Ruach of the Yid who was thinking that he's giving the Eibishter, and the Nachas Ruach of the Yid who was thinking that the Eibishter himself was feeding him. This was the kind of level of Tmimus and Pshitas. And this was the Baal Shem Tov's endeavor, which brought him a level of leadership in the Tzaddikim Nistarim. And this plan, which started 300 years ago this year in Shnas Tovei Alav Bracha, 1712, now we're going to 2012 in a couple of days, yes, was implemented Meshach a whole generation. The first thing they did was help Yidden Begashmias. And once they helped Yidden Begashmias, they helped Yidden Beruchnias, and slowly but surely they revitalized Yahadis Payul. And of course, as we know, the Baal Shem Tov himself participated in this. Baal Shem Tov himself participated in this endeavor, but these stories I'll tell you.